What's up everyone, I'm Dimitri in case you're new to the channel. Thank you for tuning in today, and as you can see behind me here, I have my bike and a bike frame and some tools, and today I'm going to show you guys how to change out your bike frames. Now, a lot of people, they go to their local shops when they need parts changed because it can seem like a very scary task trying to take apart your bike, especially when you have expensive parts and you don't want to break anything. So, without further ado, I'm going to show you guys everything I know on how to take apart your bike, so stay tuned and thank you guys for watching. So before we get started, I just want to give you guys a quick rundown of what things you're going to need in order to take apart your bike. Starting with the most important thing is your 17mm ratchet and the extension if you have pegs. Now, most bikes will have a 17mm in the back and the front. Some run a 15 and some maybe even a 14mm. It all depends on what bike parts you run, but as long as you have a ratchet set, you won't have any problem taking off your wheels. Now, you're going to need an Allen key set as well. Most parts on the BMX bike are typically a 6mm, so as long as you have a 6mm, you should be fine. In my case, I have a couple parts that require an 8mm, but this ratchet set has that, so I'm all set. And lastly, the only thing you're going to want is some grease or something to lubricate the inside where your bearings are going to go, because you're going to have your bottom bracket bearings as well as your head tube bearings, alright? So you want to make sure that everything is super greased and is running smoothly before you start riding your bike. We're going to start off here on the bottom bracket, and you just want to take a quick look at your bottom bracket before you switch out your frame. Make sure that you've got all your components. Make sure you take note of how many spacers you've got on each side. Take note that of the dust washers you've got, and also, believe it or not, but so many people mess this up. When you're switching out your frame, you gotta remember what side your chain goes on, because there's been so many times where myself or a friend, we put our bikes back together and then we put our sprocket on the wrong side and then we have to switch everything out. So make sure you take note of that first before you do anything, so that when you put it onto your other frame, it all goes smoothly. First, I'm going to begin by loosening the sprocket bolt on the back of the sprocket here, which goes into the crank arm, and then I'm going to loosen the crank arm bolts here, so that way we can just pull the cranks off and get on with the rest of the bottom bracket. We've got our sprocket bolt off. I'm just going to loosen my crank arm bolts, and then we'll be able to pull out all the internals. The cranks are now loose and we can just pull them off. Now, some cranks, if you haven't greased them in forever, they're extremely hard to get off. Don't be afraid to use a hammer. Sometimes what I like to do is take a cloth or something, put it over the crank so I'm not scratching it, and then hit it off. But in my case, I keep my bike greased a lot, so my crank arm just slips right off just like that. And as you can see, my sprocket fell down, but we can just grab that and put that on the ground, and then I have a whole bunch of washers here that came off this side, and as you can see, I've got my spacer and then my dust washer that goes on the outside of the bearing to protect it from dust. So you want to make sure that you keep these in the same order. What I like to do is, once I take all my hardware off, I like to keep it on. Here, as you can see here, I'm just going to slide that down, take these ones here, put that on, and then I'll put my other crank arm on, and then put my bolts back on. That way I'm not losing any of my parts or bolts, so that we can continue with our bike build. So for now, I'm just going to put these to the side. Like I said, this can get very, very dirty, so you want to keep a towel on hand. You don't need to clean your parts just yet unless you want to, but before I put all these other parts onto the other frame, I will clean them down and re-grease everything just to make sure everything is running just perfectly. So I'm going to place these parts over on the side for now and get started with taking out these bottom bracket bearings. My personal opinion, the bottom bracket is the hardest part of the bike to take care of and take off of the bike, and many shops probably have their own tools that they use to take out these bearings without damaging them, because people say that hitting them out can cause damage, but personally I've been doing that my entire life. I've never had any issues with my bottom bracket. As long as you re-grease everything and keep it clean, you should be set. So I'm going to show you guys a quick little trick on how I get my bearings out. I'm going to lay my bike on its side here, and this will give us the perfect template to work with. So as you can see inside here, we have our bearing, and then we have these tubes inside. And as you can see, I pushed it down there. So those there are the spacers on the inside. I'll explain to you what those do in a minute, but to get these bearings out, what you have to do is use your ratchet extension or some sort of piece of metal that'll fit in here, and you're gonna want to angle it down and push these spacers down so that you can catch the edge of the opposite bearing, and then you want to hammer this down so that the bearing falls out of the bottom. I'll show you guys what I mean in a second. Push that spacer that's in between the bearings back so you can catch the edge of the bearing, and you're just gonna tap it, and then you want to tap it all around on different sides so you're getting equal pressure around, because if you hit out one end, it'll get lodged in there. So you want to get equal pressure so you're pushing it out at the same time, and with just a few hits it should just come out just like that. So as you can see, what fell out is the bearing, and then we have our spacer, and then because my frame bottom bracket is just a little big, I have an additional spacer inside. So keep track of what's inside of your bottom bracket and make sure that what's coming out of it is going into the next frame. Now all we gotta do is hit out this second one. Easy as that. So this whole bottom bracket is probably the messiest part of the bike, but to make it easier on you guys, I'm just gonna throw it into the other frame now so we can get the cranks on and get on with the rest of our bike build. Now it's time to put all this here right back into there, as well as my sprocket. I left that over there, still gotta clean that. But so now I'm gonna show you guys how to do this. So as you can see, I've got my bike frame here set up on shoes, just because we are gonna have to hammer in our bearings here back into the frame, just like we hammered them out. It's not as difficult as it seems. So before we get started though, we have to grease up our where the bearings are gonna go. So my phone died while I was recording, and I just figured I'd do this quick illustration for you guys so you can get a little better understanding of what the bottom bracket is and why there's all these pieces and components to it. So basically, I'm going to explain what this here is, this center spacer, and why it's there. So we're going to pretend here that this is the spindle that goes through the frame. This here is the whole bottom bracket. You've got your bearings, and so this is your spindle which your cranks connect to, and this spacer here goes in between these bearings. Now the reason that spacer is there is because when you attach your cranks to both sides and then you tighten the bolts down, you have pressure on both sides going in this way, right? So that's going to cause stress on these bearings, and it's going to cave them inwards. Now if this spacer weren't there, those bearings would be compressed so much that your bottom bracket wouldn't even spin. So if you guys are out there trying to save weight on your bike, don't save weight by trying to remove little important pieces like this, because as a kid, that was something that I did that unfortunately ruined my bearings. So don't make the same mistake I did. Keep all those parts in there and make sure everything is running smoothly before you get on your bike. So without further ado, let's go back to the bike and check it out. So to make sure you're doing everything right here on the bottom bracket, one thing that I like to do before putting in all my components is measuring everything out. So I'm gonna measure up my big spacer and that little one along with these bearings and hold it up to here to make sure it's spaced out perfectly, because I don't want any extra space in here when we go to put the cranks on. So as you can see right here, this is a perfect fit on both sides, and that's with that little tiny spacer included. As you can see, it's right in there. So sometimes it's necessary to have those. If you need a larger spacer, sometimes, well, this spacer here will actually be the same size as the spacers on the outside of the cranks, outside of the dust caps. So as you can see, this here is slightly thicker than this one here, which will have a different effect on how this whole part of your bike runs. As you can see, it is harder putting the bearings in than taking them out. It can take some time, it can be difficult, but just be patient with it. Try not to damage your bearings. Sometimes it's easier to take something. Unfortunately, I don't have something flat that I can hammer right now, but if you put something flat over it and hammer it, you can get even pressure on it when putting in the bearing, which is really important because that's what bike shops do. They have a bearing press which compresses everything from both sides, which allows the bearings just to slide right into place perfectly. But unfortunately, I don't have that here at my ease, so I'm just gonna hammer them in. Now we're gonna flip the frame here, and then we're going to put in our spacers. Another piece down, and then put your larger one on, and then just throw it down in there. Make sure everything's lined up, because sometimes those little spacers don't line up right, and then it can be a hassle in the end. And sometimes it's even easiest just to take your spindle and put it through there just to hold everything in place as you put in your second bearing. So without further ado, let's get this second bearing in. So as you can see, we have now successfully put our bearings into our frame, and we have our spacers in there. Now this is what I was talking about, how these can get caught up a little bit. As you can see, it's not lined up, so I will have to move this around in order to get my spindle in to put the rest of the cranks on. Simply, if you are having an issue with these being stuck, all you gotta do is take your ratchet extension and hammer that back bearing out just a smudge, just enough to loosen everything up in there. And then once we get our cranks on and we tighten the compression bolts, it'll compress everything back together, so no need to hammer in the other bearing once you loosen it a little bit. So now that we have our bearings in our frame, we can finally begin to put the cranks on. So what I'm going to start off with is the spindle. We're going to throw our spindle on after we grease it up, and then put our cranks on, making sure that we have our right crank on the right side and the left crank on the left side, and additionally making sure we have all the correct parts where they need to be. So now we are perfect. Now we can put on our spacers, our sprocket, and our cranks. The right one is going to be different from the left one depending on what side you ride. So if you're right hand drive, meaning that all your components, your sprocket and your driver on the back wheel are on your right side, you're gonna have a smaller washer on the right side to make up for the space of the sprocket, whereas your non-sprocket side is gonna have a larger washer to make up for the space of not having the sprocket there. So I'm going to start off here. One thing that you want to make sure of is that you're putting the right crank on. So as you can see here, my cranks here are marked, and it has the length and a R, and this one here has an L. So these are 175s, and this here is the right crank, and this here is the left crank. Their cranks are always marked, and what happens is if you put the wrong crank on, your pedals will come loose. So now that we've got this crank on, we've got to throw our second crank on along with our spacers. So we're going to throw the spacers on real quick. And now some of you guys might have different cranks. Some of you guys might have an 8 spline, which are a lot easier to line up. These are a 48 spline, which means that there's 48 cutouts in this and 48 cutouts in here, which have to line up. Now, it's pretty simple to be 1 or 2 cutouts off when lining these up. So you want to make sure, what I like to do is just let gravity let this one hang and then put this one on as straight up as possible, and hopefully they'll be lined up. So let's see, and typically you'll be able to tell just by looking at it if it's lined up, and I got it first try. So now all we gotta do is put this last compression bolt on, tighten it up, and then throw on our sprocket bolt, and the bottom bracket will then be complete. And as you can see, my cranks are now tight and they spin perfectly, so no problems at all. And last but not least, we just have to put our sprocket bolt in here, and then the bottom bracket is complete. I'm going to set this aside for the time being, and we're going to grab the other bike and work on the head tube. Now, easiest to work on this while sitting on the bike, you can just sit here, take everything apart, and similarly to the bottom bracket, we're going to take all the hardware off in the same order and put it back on just as it came off, so that way we can transfer to the frame as easy as possible. In order to take off your stem and get to the bearings and take your forks off and everything, you gotta first loosen your compression bolt. This top compression bolt compresses everything down to make it tight. So loosen this, and then your side compression bolts, so that'll loosen the stem. You can pull the stem off, and then all the internal hardware. Like I said, we're going to put everything back onto the fork just as it came off, but in my case, I got a brand new headset from one of my buddies, Marin. So this here's going in the garbage, but it's broken anyway. I just found that out. That's really interesting. But, so I need a new one anyways, but, so that's broken. I'll show you guys the order it goes on in just 2 seconds. So this is the new headset I got from one of my friends. It's a Fiction headset, and so we're gonna throw it on there. They are identical bearings, and then you've got here your race. That's like a little compression thing that goes on the top, and then you have a little washer that goes over that, and then last but not least, your dust cap, and that'll be the last thing to go on. Gonna move this frame here out of the way, and then we're gonna go right to this one and get started. So similar to the bottom bracket, doing your whole head tube setup requires grease as well, because any part where you have moving parts, you're definitely going to want to have grease, because grease helps it spin better. So we're going to grease up both the top and bottom of our head tube, throw our bearings in, and then get on with the forks. So now that we've got our bottom and top bearing in, we can just simply take our forks, slide it up through the bottom, and then this is where the bike begins to come together. Put this piece in, so slide that over, slide it down, put our washer on, and then, last but not least, our dust cap, which goes right on top. And now you want to make sure you can grease this as well too. You want to be generous with the grease, because the more grease you use, the better your bike's going to run, and that's what everyone wants. That's what you're here for. So make sure, guys, if you're building your bike, you're using grease. It's a very, very, very important thing to be doing. I've also got a spacer that I use, so I'm going to throw my spacer on. And last but not least, all we got to do is put our bars on just the way they came off, making sure that when we put them on, what we're going to do is put our compression bolt on first to compress everything down, make sure everything is tight, and then align our bars and tighten these compression bolts.
Hey.
I'm going to save tightening and aligning the bars till the end, only because we don't have the back end built, and it is a little bit funky trying to align your bars without having the back wheel on and the bike level. So what we're going to do is we're going to finish up the rest of our build, get this back wheel on, our seat on, and then finish up the bars and put the chain on, and then we're done. So now we're on to the very last part of our bike. The only thing you guys got to remember here when taking off the back wheel is that if you have pegs, make sure you have your extension, have the right size, and last but not least, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey as it always is, and your back wheel should come off no problem at all. before we throw this back wheel onto our new frame real quick, I'm going to take off this seat, put it on that frame. Nearly complete with our bike build. All we have left to do is to throw the seat on, the back wheel, align the chain and the handlebars, and we are all the way done with the wheel on. I recommend standing the bike up on its handlebars. It makes it the easiest, so that way it's working at the same height as you. So we're just going to tip it upside, grab our chain, grab our back wheel, put the chain on our driver, just like this. Space out pegs if you got pegs on it. Try and move these washers out of the way, and then line it up with the tail of the bike and just throw it on there. Now you can take your chain, put it on there, and pull the back wheel onto the bike. And now all we gotta do is tighten up the chain and the back wheel, throw our seat on, and we're pretty much complete with our build. So to give you guys a better view of what's going on here, we've got our chain here. It's going all the way down to our sprocket, connected to our sprocket. And then all I gotta do here is throw on my hub guard, which goes right in there. And then we just gotta pull the wheel backwards to tighten up that chain and tighten down the pegs.
Hey.
Throw our seat on and tighten our stem. So simply just put your seat post in, put it. And now that our seat is on, all we have left to do is to tighten these bars, and our bike build is complete. So let's align these bars and complete our build. So guys, as you can see behind me is the completed build. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And let me know in the comments below what you guys want to see more of. Today I decided to build you guys a new bike, teach you guys how to take apart your bike and how to rebuild it. So hopefully you guys learned something today and can use something from this video. Stay tuned for more, and thanks for watching. Peace!